Hi everyone, welcome to the Unhandled Exception podcast. I'm Dan Clark and this is episode number 22. So I don't think we've had an episode where Rider hasn't come up in one form or another, either from me mentioning it or a guest saying, Dan, you're a big Rider fan, aren't you? I think I must be getting a bit of a reputation for it. So I think everyone that knows me knows that I'm a massive fan. And I thought it was about time we had an episode on it. And this is going to be another group episode, which I always enjoy. And today I'm joined by Martin Balio and Kirill Skrygan. So perhaps if we start, and if you can both introduce yourselves and say what it is you do.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm Martin and developer advocate at Jetbrains for all of our .NET tools. So that's ReSharper, that is Rider, that's .trace, .memory, and everything around that. As a developer advocate, I think essentially the main thing is to be there in the community, be visible, and be talking to people about our products, about what they can do, what they can be helped with. But also when they don't match, bring feedback back to the team and make sure that we actually look at adding specific features or functionality that is available. Besides that, developer advocates typically at JetBrains also means that you get commit access to the code bases, which is nice. It's also a bit of a shortcut, I think, to become a developer on the products. But if you're using the Azure plugin in Rider, there's lots of work that I've been doing on that one.
Very cool, very cool. How about you, Kir?
Yeah, I'm Kir. I'm at JetBrains for more than 10 years, I guess, almost 11. I started to work as a developer at ReSharper. Then I became the first developer of Rider, and we started a product, and I became a team lead of Rider. And I was leading Rider for more than 5 years, I guess. Somewhere in between, I decided that we have to do something with collaborative editing feature, and we started Code With Me project, which is already released everywhere except Rider. And so right now, do only business development in Rider. My main focus is, even not Code With Me, is mostly remote development for IntelliJ and the whole ecosystem, including Rider as well.
Very cool. I'm sure Code With Me is definitely something we'll be talking about a bit later as well. So before we jump into Rider, a quick mention of this episode's listener mention. And this one goes to Natraj Yagna Arman. Again, sorry if I've pronounced your name incorrectly. The names in this episode are quite tricky. And he tweeted, started Saturday morning listening to @Drakan and @A.Frank in the Unhandled Exception podcast. Fantastic episode. I really enjoy learning Bicep because the tooling is amazing and it has helped me understand Azure better. So thanks, Natraj. I totally agree. The tooling is a big part of what sold Bicep to me, and he's referring to the last episode where I was joined by Alex Frankel, a PM at Microsoft and also a maintainer of the Bicep language. So Rider. So I'm aware that we're probably going to cover a lot in this episode, and I suspect that later on we're going to go a bit down the rabbit hole talking about Rider internals and architecture, and there's obviously also Code With Me that we've already mentioned. But shall we start at the beginning? And just in case any of the listeners don't even know what Rider is, can we start off with a quick Rider elevator pitch?
Absolutely. I'll go with a really quick one if possible. Rider is a cross-platform .NET IDE that supports all of the different frameworks and essentially looks and feels the same on Linux, on Windows, and on macOS, and is powered by IntelliJ platform for anything you see in terms of UI and other languages, and powered by ReSharper underneath for all of the .NET tooling that is available in there.
One thing you mentioned about ReSharper then, which for those that don't know is a Visual Studio extension, and I think that's probably one of the reasons I fell so much for Rider, because when I was using Visual Studio, I'd been like a very long time ReSharper fan anyway, so the transition to Rider, it just felt so natural. I guess one of the things for me, which is what makes me love Rider so much, is because I'm personally a massive keyboard shortcut fan. And I just find that Rider takes this to the next level. So both with ReSharper and Rider, there's a ton of shortcuts to make the developer more productive, like Shift or was it Control-T to find anything, Alt Enter to refactor anything, Control Insert to insert stuff. But Rider even has shortcuts for just manipulating the IDE. For example, something I use a lot is like Control Shift and then the arrow keys for resizing panes and panels. And it's just lots of little things like this that really add up. Have you found that as part of designing Rider or developing Rider that you've really tried to focus on that, on keyboard shortcuts and productivity and all this kind of thing?
It was from the very beginning of both IntelliJ and ReSharper. And those guys, they were like keyboard maniacs. And it like literally when I first came to JetBrains office, and I was so happy. And well, I supposed to be in a .cover team, to be honest. But all of a sudden, it turns out I will be a ReSharper developer. And Ilya Rzhenkov, who used to be a PM of ReSharper, and he is really good. And he actually designed, not just the single features, but features being connected to each other, the user story which embraces the chain of the features. So he designed all of this, and of course he was using this by himself. And he he asked me, like, do you know the product? I said, of course I do. And of course I knew only Altentra or something, as typical 20 years old students know about ReSharper. Not all of them, of course, but still. And okay, he sat behind me, and he was just watching for a while how I was coding, and it lasted not more than 30 seconds, maybe 1 minute, because I totally freaked him out, and he told me, "Wait, no, you don't have to do this." So he just moved away the mouse, took the keyboard, and boom, 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 boom. It was so magic, It was so like it's just a totally different approach. And the thing I supposed to do in 10 minutes, just technical things of code something, he coded in a minute. And then I realized, wow, this is the tool I wanna work on. This is really cool. So it just was an illustration that, of course, all of the developers, PMs, both for IntelliJ, ReSharper, and like all of our tools, because we all use our tools by ourselves. So all of them, they try to do it as keyboard centric as possible.
I can actually add an example of someone on Twitter this week who was asking how they could assign a shortcut to a specific feature that did not have a shortcut. So I was looking in the settings, and you can actually create your own key maps if you want and add your own keyboard shortcuts. But it turned out that actually finding an available shortcut is the more difficult part than just assigning it.
Yeah, I can imagine. Funnily enough, what you were saying about the mouse, I had a conversation yesterday. So there's a team I'm working with. They're using Rider more, and they're just doing more stuff in Azure. So I'm coming in, helping them out with that, and moving to Git as well, and all that kind of thing. And I had a conversation with someone yesterday, and I remember saying one of my goals is to get you guys to use the mouse less, because exactly like you're saying, there's lots of stuff that I find other developers do which are very manual, when actually one keyboard shortcut can do that across the whole project for you. And I just find the amount of time it saves is insane, especially when you add them all together.
Yeah, correct. I also find that it's not just about time. Of course, it is very important. I admit that this might be related to some different psychological types, but for myself, I'm quite sure that distracting and using a mouse once in a while just consumes my, like mind energy. So it's like a little tiny bit of my mind, of my focus, that I have to get off my hand off the keyboard and like drag the mouse and then get it back. And this like sucks my energy just for a little bit. And I think this matters as well.
I'm actually a big Vim fan as well, because, I use a Vim extension in Rider, the idea Vim, and this could actually become a whole podcast episode on like not moving the hands away from the keyboard, but we probably should get back on track, because if you get me talking about this, we'll be here all day. So I actually remember, when was it? So most of our listeners will know I run a .NET user group as well called .NET Oxford, and I think it was back in 2017. We had Matt Ellis from JetBrains coming talking about taking ReSharper out of process for Rider.
Ah, Matt. Yeah, it was. Yeah, no, but that time it was Matt and Martin, and of course Hadi, and like these were the DA folks which were talking about Rider mostly, right?
Yeah, because I think one thing I hear a lot about ReSharper in Visual Studio is it's a common thing that I hear, that it just slows it down too much, so developers get put off it. Where for Rider, I just find it insanely quick. I've quite often just have like 10 instances of Rider. It just doesn't slow down my machine at all. So this brings back to like Matt's talk about taking ReSharper out of process. So am I right that the ReSharper engine for Rider is sitting in a different process, and is it using protobuf or something just to communicate?
It is a separate process and it is bound with the front end with our own protocol. Firstly, we tried to use protobuf and some other already developed protocols, but we quickly realized that it's just not enough, both in terms of richness of the protocol and the performance of the protocol. So we developed our own. It is open sourced. It is called RD. You can browse it and find it in GitHub under JetBrains account. So the key things about this protocol is that it supports both stateful and stateless communication. By saying stateful, I mean, kind of this typical in a reactive manner stateful entities. So you update the state and you get the I notify property change on another side, something like this. Apart from that, there are some transient and stateless signals, tasks, which has nothing to do with the shared state. What is also interesting is that since like both of these counterparts, ReSharper and IntelliJ, I remind you that the front end part is based on IntelliJ platform. The back end part for either is based on ReSharper. So these are huge programs. They have their own quite complicated lifecycle. And to synchronize this life cycle, we have to introduce lifetimes for protocol entities. So you have to have very simple and a convenient way to manage the lifetimes of an object. So this protocol also supports the lifetime. For example, I know the lifetime of my solution. I know the lifetime of my view model, which appeared on the backend. I know when it's ready. I know when it will be gone. And this is quite crucial because all of these view models we actually transfer through this protocol. They are nested into each other in a hierarchical order. So, for example, if I dispose the project, of course, I disposed all the nested editors inside this project, open editors. And if any of these editors got an opened lookup for code completion, lookup window, it also should be disposed in a safe way. So all of this is supported. Please give it a try, take a look, RT. It's a great piece of technology, I would say. And the thing is that we bound not just our front end and back end with RD, we use it for much more. Since basically Rider is very distributed IDE. For example, we launched the build in a separate MS build task. We load the project in a separate process. We connect to Unity editor for game dev developers with RG protocol, or we do entity framework migrations in a separate process as well. So it's kind of microservices for an IDE. And all of that is bound with RG, which supports both stateful and stateless communications.
I didn't actually know this was a separate library, so we'll definitely include a link to that in the show notes. I think that before you properly think about it, it sounds like quite a simple concept. You've got the IDE, which is the view, and then in a separate process you put the ReSharper engine. But as you just described, there's actually so much complexity and edge cases and all things you've got to handle to do that. When you actually stop and think about it, it becomes a really big problem.
Yeah, there's also the other effect where you actually have multiple people working on your code base. Well, multiple people, it's actually you as a developer, but there might be, for example, a refactoring that takes a couple of seconds to execute. And who wins? Does the codes that you are writing in the editor currently, is that the latest version of the code base, or is the result of the refactoring that ReSharper in the backend has been executing, is that the result? So the protocol also handles lots of those version conflicts and makes sure that everything becomes logical and just keeps working and compiles in the end.
Yeah, I don't really have that problem because I don't write code at all. I just alt enter my way through everything, and the ReSharper engine just does it all for me by magic. No, concurrency is hard. I think most developers know that. So yeah, it sounds like a massive problem. So going back to the thing I mentioned about Visual Studio, where a lot of developers, their first thing they say is it slows down Visual Studio. And as far as my understanding is that Visual Studio plugins, extensions generally tend to be in the same process space as Visual Studio. And obviously, Visual Studio is quite big and heavy. ReSharper engine is quite big and heavy. Or when I say heavy, I mean it does a lot. So throwing those into the same process, that kind of explains the slowdown. But am I right that in the roadmap somewhere that you also plan to do the same for ReSharper for Visual Studio and take that out of process too?
Yeah, that's definitely something that we are working on. Actually, we have an issue in our issue tracker where you can follow progress. Sometimes there is progress, sometimes nothing happens for release. So, for example, in the past release, all of our effort has really been focused on making sure that ReSharper can support the new Visual Studio 2022. The reason that that was such an effort is that Visual Studio switched from being a 32-bit process to being a 64-bit process. So what you would typically see with older Visual Studio versions is memory space there is not unlimited. You have a 32-bit process, and even on your 64-core laptop that has 128 gigabytes of memory, on a good day, you can only use close to 3 gigabytes of memory there. That shares Visual Studio, that shares WPF, that shares all of the COM interrupt that is going on, that shares ReSharper in there, where Roslyn is there, and everything that powers Visual Studio. So most of our effort now on out of process has been making sure that we can actually compile and target Visual Studio 2022. We are still looking at decoupling things a bit more and going more towards that rider model of having a different process that powers all of the ReSharper smarts. But we are observing now in Visual Studio 2022 that 64 bits is actually much better for Visual Studio. It's much more responsive with ReSharper. You don't see any visible garbage collection going on that slows down the editor. So it's actually quite nice to try it in the new Visual Studio version.
Oh, that's really nice. I hadn't thought about that. So the fact that 22 is 64-bit anyway kind of means that there's less reason to take it into another process.
It absolutely gives much more breathing room to what ReSharper is doing, but also to what Visual Studio is doing. You can also see that Microsoft themselves are moving towards this out of process model. So if you fire up VS 2022, you will see in Task Manager that it actually spawns a lot of processes. I think it even runs Node.js for some things. So there's really a lot of similarity in the architecture that Microsoft is building for Visual Studio and what we have been doing in the writer space.
You mentioned about Visual Studio 2022, and obviously that's like new and upcoming. But there's also a lot of other .NET stuff coming from Microsoft. Things like obviously Blazor's quite new. We've got Blazor Desktop coming up. We've got the Hot Reload. We've got .NET MAUI. That must be quite a difficult thing to keep up to date because obviously the Visual Studio developers are internal. So there's probably lots of internal communications to actually keep Visual Studio up to date. I'm assuming that at JetBrains you also have quite a very close relationship with Microsoft and the .NET team.
Well, we have a very good communication on technical level, that's for sure, with Microsoft. So speaking about the new technologies we have to catch up with, we are quite cautious here because some of these technologies are not actually quite becoming very popular and not becoming very useful. And although Microsoft on the first release says it will change the future of everything and etc., it turns out that only half of those actually go in the real industry. So first of all, we really keep a traction of this technology. We see the traction. We understand whether this will be successful or not. For example, when Blazor firstly came out, the beta of Blazor was about 3 years ago, 2.5. So it was quite promising technology, but we were not sure how they will implement it. Will it be good or will it be not good? So it turns out a little bit later that yes, they will do it in the right way and the industry will obviously switch to Blazor. And the moment we realized that, we immediately started to work to support that. And this happens to all of the rest of technologies because we don't have enough resources to blindly go and support everything from the very early alpha that Microsoft gives to the public. So we try to see the traction and to support only those which are really matter.
Yeah, I suspect Blazor is going to be quite a big one because I'm seeing so much traction with Blazor at the moment. And I know that I've got a few projects I want to convert over as soon as, pretty much as soon as I've got time. And especially, I think, with Blazor Desktop. So obviously you've got .NET MAUI, which is desktop applications cross-platform. But having Blazor so you can do the same style of programming in web, desktop, cross-platform, and potentially, I think in experimental mode, they've got Blazor mobile as well. I think this is just experimental at the moment. But I think it just feels like Blazor is certainly going to become a massive thing. So please put good support in Rider. The listeners can't see me praying through the webcam here, but
But maybe so bold to ask you then, why do you think that Maui and Blazor Desktop, and as you mentioned, maybe Blazor for mobile, can either beat or at least stop the upcoming popularity of Flutter, and can it actually get some Flutter users back to .NET ecosystem? What do you think?
So, one, for people that are already .NET developers, it's the same language, concepts. But there's also other benefits, like, for example, DTOs, so shared DTOs. Quite often, if I'm writing a front end in React or something, or whatever it is, in JavaScript, and I've got .NET web APIs, then I've got to keep the front end DTOs and the back end DTOs in sync, where in Blazor I can have a shared assembly. And it's just for me, I find that I'm a .NET developer at heart, but I do full stack development.
Mm-hmm.
And so I can do React. I've done projects in React, Vue, Angular, but everything I do, I've got to look up on Google, where .NET comes natively to me. And even like things like if I'm using Blazor, WASM, where .NET's running in the browser, so I'll be using things like HTTP client. I'm used to using HTTP client, so to use the .NET HTTP client instead of the React HTTP client, which I'm just used to using, it's just all like much more natural to me. So yeah, I just think that it's going to be very appealing for .NET developers, and I also think .NET is becoming more and more popular as people outside the .NET space are starting to learn. And I know .NET's been open source cross-platform for quite some time, but us in that space know that. But people outside the .NET space, people are only just starting to really see how open .NET is now. I think the popularity is going to grow and grow. And as Blazor just becomes one of the choices due to React, Angular, Vue, Blazor, it's just going to become one of those choices. It's not going to take over them, but it's going to be just another choice, which I think is going to be quite popular, especially from the .NET space where the whole Blazor component model, which has taken ideas off things like React, where everything's a very small component. I think just that which is very, very powerful. I think that's going to be very appealing for .NET developers.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
Presumably you've got like stats of usages and things within Rider.
I'm constantly monitoring the industry and the market, and I see that Xamarin is big in absolute numbers, but I don't see a lot of dynamics for Xamarin ecosystem. Well, but I definitely see some very positive dynamics for Flutter. It's growing. It used to grow. It's growing right now. I don't have exact numbers. I don't have examples, but it seems to me that it might be getting, the Flutter is getting some customers from Xamarin. So if you want to do something cross-platform for desktop and mobile, so some of users will presumably choose Flutter, but of course they will think about the Microsoft stack. And I'm always wondering, how do they choose? What do they take into account? That's why I love to asking the real people from the real industry.
Well, I guess it's everyone's different depending on their background. So I personally have grown up with a lot of Microsoft technologies. So I've used Visual Studio for a very, very long time. My background is in the games industry doing C and C++, where I was doing Xbox programming, and that was in Visual Studio. And then I moved on to .NET, and that was in Visual Studio. Obviously, I use Rider now, but it's still like very Microsoft .NET-y. And so my views are probably quite biased to a lot of the community I'm in. So like the .NET Oxford user group, the stuff I read online is probably very biased towards the .NET space anyway. So I'm not seeing much of the other communities like you're mentioning Flutter. So I'm kind of like I probably need to actually step out and look in these other communities as well and just get a bigger picture of what's going on. So we've mentioned a few times other languages, actually, like things like Angular, React and things. And I did mention that I'm kind of a full stack developer, so I do front end stuff too in like other languages. And one thing I really do like about Rider is the fact that I do all of these things in Rider. Even though Rider is a .NET IDE, I'm assuming because it's built on top of a common IDE platform. But I do find that I still get all the amazing IDE experience in Rider when doing like JavaScript programming or React or whatever, like the linting, the alt enter, just all that kind of stuff. So presumably, is that just a side effect of it all being built on the same common ID platform?
I think that's indeed pretty much the case. So frontend is IntelliJ, and we decided with Rider to bundle some of the plugins that we have in IntelliJ as well. So you will have all of the web tooling, for example, that Rider shares with WebStorm, our dedicated web IDE. You get all of those in there. We have data grip bundled as well. So if you want to work with any type of database, there's actually really good support for it, even though it's hidden in one of the smaller tool windows there. I definitely think you should give it a try because there's amazing features to refactor your database or to get completion on join statements and things like that. But yeah, it really boils down to being in that IntelliJ platform and being able to borrow some of the plugins and some of the work that other teams in JetBrains are doing. Probably Kirill knows more about this. I think one of the interesting facts, though, is that while Rider has great support for Angular, React, and all of that, in ReSharper, we actually also have some of the JavaScript and CSS and HTML tooling because obviously there we are extending Visual Studio's functionality as well. And I kind of forgot what the current status is there, if we are still surfacing the ReSharper JavaScript functionality in Rider or not. But it is kind of interesting to be in those two IDEs and two plugin ecosystems.
We choose, so it depends on the quality, and it depends of actually lots of things. So for most of the web support, we choose IntelliJ modules, because generally speaking, JetBrains invests much more when we're speaking about JavaScript support, whatever it is, Angular, React, or anything. So JetBrains invests much more in IntelliJ rather than in ReSharper. So right now, the amount of features and the overall editing experience in JavaScript, WebStorm, and IntelliJ for web is much better than ReSharper. It used to be in a different way 6-7 years ago, because at that time ReSharper had also quite decent support for JavaScript and CSS. But time changed. However, some of the things still, not C# things are still supported from the backend. Some of the dialects, some of the languages. But yeah, Martin's right, and this is the benefit that we get from IntelliJ comes from the thick front end. The front end we're using is not really a thin front end; it's a thick IDE, thick IntelliJ. It has nothing to do with C#, right? But it has fully blown JavaScript support and CSS support and etc.
It's also maybe tacking onto our previous discussion on the protocol and architecture of Rider. It's also, I find it quite impressive if you use the database tooling, for example, which is all front end, which is all IntelliJ based, and you connect to a database model where IntelliJ knows about all of the tables and all of the columns in your tables and so on. If you then start writing C# codes and you open a string literal and you start typing select star from one of the tables that you have in the database, you will actually get code completion inside of that string that is powered by the front end, while all of the surrounding C# codes is powered by the backend ReSharper process. So that's also one of the benefits. Both are an IDE, and the protocol also allows us to mix and match wherever it kind of makes sense.
Yeah. Or for example, good old classy ASPX files, which are still used in the industry, they're not supported by any kind of WebStorm features, so we have to support with the backend engine. Or the most insane thing comes when we go to Razor files, which can combine C#, HTML, JavaScript, CSS, and you can actually have JavaScript in HTML inside of this JavaScript, another HTML inside this HTML, some C#, and all of this is actually supported. And what is the most astonishing thing is that all of this is supported with the help of two sides, like the front end and the back end. So we lex the whole file structure. We understand the chunks of the file, which should be supported by which part. For example, this is the JavaScript. This should be supported by the front end. This is the C# injected into HTML. This should be supported by, and and we combine all this together. We were doing this for 2 years.
Wow, that sounds like some impressive code. I think if I looked at it, my mind would just melt, I think, to be able to do all that. Out of interest, when you said that, because you've got the ReSharper engine, which the front end uses, but then you said that IntelliJ already has JavaScript in. Does that mean like JavaScript doesn't use a separate process and JavaScript is just part of IntelliJ?
Yes, that's correct. The JavaScript analysis and all the features are being performed in the same process where you edit a file, in the same process of which holds the UI thread.
Yeah, fair enough. I guess JavaScript is everywhere, so that probably makes sense. I've just realised I don't actually know what language is IntelliJ built in the first place.
It's a little bit of everything. I think IntelliJ started as IntelliJ is JVM based, so that means all of the Java related languages. I think a lot of IntelliJ is just pure Java. I know some plugins are actually written in Scala. I think actually most of the Rider front-end development that is there, but also lots of people in the IntelliJ team are making use of Kotlin, which is our own JVM language that is fully compatible with Java, but it looks and feels more natural. So I'm a C# developer myself, for example, but writing something in the Rider frontend is also not too scary because Kotlin actually looks very much like C# and has lots of similar constructs and similar ways of working.
Yeah, I've heard of Kotlin, but I've never played around with it. So it's one of the things on my very long list of things to look into. It's getting longer by the day. So we should probably jump into code with me because this is something I'm super excited about because obviously nowadays we do a lot of remote. We've got a lot of remote teams and I'm remote from now onwards, really. So being able to just collaborate without just taking turns screen sharing just sounds amazing to me. But I think you mentioned before that it's available everywhere but Rider.
Yes.
Is this something that's coming quite soon?
It's supposed to come soon for a year right now. As always.
The listeners can't see your expression at the moment, but it sounds like you've hit quite a few pain points.
Yeah, that's true. It's kind of a very monumental work to be done because, as we've discussed, Rider itself is a client-server application, right? And then we have Code with Me, which is also client-server application, meaning that the guest is the client and the host is a server, right? So if we talk about Rider, the guest is the client, the host is a server, but the server itself is also client-server application. So have kind of matryoshka situation, when we have client-server inside the server. And this makes the overall architecture quite nasty. And we wanted to do this in the right way. So not only, for example, C# would be supported by Code with Me, but as you mentioned, JavaScript in the Rider. And JavaScript is supported by IntelliJ part of the Rider. C# is supported by ReSharper part of Rider. But both should be transferred to the guest on the other part of the ocean, for example. So lots of things had to be rewritten, and we successfully refactored all this stuff. We have the prototype. We have the actually quite working prototype with the editors, with some of the tool windows. Right now, it just should be polished. It should be polished, and we are really working hard to make it available for this 21.3 release. The only reason I'm not saying that this will be there 100% is because I've been a while in this industry and I know that you get some issues, some bugs all of a sudden, and you'll take indefinite amount of time to fix them. So hopefully, finger crossed, by the end of this year, at least we finalized the big refactorings, and right now we just need to polish it.
Yeah, I think all of our listeners, well, most of our listeners are developers, so we all understand that the futility of having a deadline which you're committing to making, and sometimes it's better to just miss that deadline but get it right.
Exactly. We don't want to scare away our new users with a crappy experience.
Absolutely. And so you mentioned about client server. So the host is the server, then the guests are the clients. Does that mean that it's peer-to-peer, or when you're coding, does your data go via Jetbrains servers, or is it literally peer-to-peer?
We have different options here. Basically, we have 3 different kinds of connections for Code with Me. First is the default one is the connection through our relay servers, which are deployed around the world. Second one is the direct connection in the same internet with the direct IP address. And the third one is quite interesting, is a peer-to-peer connection. Even though you can not be in the same network, you can be under your own NAT. Still, there are some technologies which allows you to punch through the connection, punch through the NATs. So when we launched the guest, when we creating a Code with Me session, we simultaneously try to create all of these three connections, all of the three wires, and we choose which of those actually works better. So right now we see that for about 40% of our users, we choose peer-to-peer connections. This is quite interesting piece of technology. You can Google for Quick protocol made by Google or Quish. This is a protocol on top of the UDP. And this is quite cool, interesting stuff, how to do peer-to-peer connection. What else to say? Just not to forget that Code with Me supports multiple guests. So you can have up to 100 guests being connected to the single host.
Really nice. I'm so looking forward to that. So my next question is probably obvious, but there's obviously VS Live, Share, and like in a team, you might have people using Rider and some people using Visual Studio. Is there any way of collaborating on the same session, even if it's via ReSharper extension in Visual Studio? Is there a way that a Visual Studio user can collaborate with a Rider user?
We build the whole architecture that the guest is just able to connect to the host without anything installed on his or her machine whatsoever. So you will download the Think client, which will weigh about 100 megs, and connect to your host and have the full-blown code completion, alt enter, etc. No pre-requirements whatsoever. So here in our approach, for example, if a guest is using VS Code and you are using Rider and you share the session, the guest will download and launch, quickly download and launch this Think client and connect to you. And by that, we try to promote Rider experience for those who are not using Rider, because the Think client will be still, like with a Rider kind of UI. So this is the way we want to promote our ecosystem. On the other hand, it is just impossible to embed our programs into VS Code. It is impossible to build a ReSharper extension for VS Code or Code with Me guest in the VS Code, because the LSP protocol of the VS Code is just not feature rich enough.
What about the full-blown Visual Studio rather than VS Code? Because I'm aware, like it sounds like, so this thin client, is that kind of like just a thin client version of Rider? Because I'm kind of wondering, as a Visual Studio guest who's pair programming all day, will want to stay in Visual Studio as part of that collaboration session rather than just using something client, I guess.
I think it's probably the same right now when you're using WebStorm or IntelliJ with Code with Me. Yes, you are developing in WebStorm, but if you want to join a session from some other host, you still have to go through that thin client. The look and feel is the same. It's all IntelliJ platform based, but it's not that you can connect from WebStorm to WebStorm. It's actually that thin client that will make the connection.
Gotcha. Yeah, so it's just all more reason to get more of the teams I work with to use Rider instead. Sounds like a win-win to me.
Perfect. One that I found interesting from being in the stand-ups of Code with Me is that there's also really cool situations where sharing of tool windows is very specific to what that tool window is offering. Like a terminal, you probably want to see as a host what your clients are doing in a terminal, whereas some other tool windows where you're exploring a file may be related to the document you as a guest are looking at, for example.
Yeah, I can imagine. So like even like test runners as well. So if one of you is running all your tests, then the other person probably wants to see that whether that's worked or not.
Well, if you follow the host, then yes, it's supposed to work this way. We just not implemented following the unit test window. We implemented following for lots of more tool windows, like Solution Explorer, for example, Terminal, Shared Terminal, others. But the unit tests are not there in the following engine yet. So, however, the guest can execute their own unit test. These unit tests will be executed, launched, investigated, etc., simultaneously to what unit test actually host launches. So this is the I think this is the beauty of the Code with Me technology, is that the guests can do everything they want simultaneously. They can type in different files. They can do more programming when, for example, one person writes the interfaces, another write the implementations or tests, or they can follow each other and they can actually track just one cursor, one selected editor, one selected tool window, the selection in this specific tool window. So they follow the same, the same focus. And you can choose. So you can either turn on the follow feature or turn off. Up to you. In cases for classrooms and educators, following is so crucial, because you don't want your students to write in your code base, aren't you? You just want them to follow you. That's it.
Quite often when I'm in teams and we're doing mob programming sessions where we just take turns driving and or talking through a new feature that's been developed, and I can imagine all the guests following you, and then you can go around and show it. Yeah, I guess like thinking about pair programming remotely, at the moment, we tend to do this via just would take turns driving and take turns sharing the screen. And so that's kind of not very collaborative, but you get a lot of other context as well. So, for example, if you've got a browser window and you're switching over, if you right click as well, like I've played around a little bit in the past with VS Live Share, and one thing that I suddenly noticed was if the other person right clicked or did Alt Enter or whatever it was to get a drop down, and they might be looking at choosing an option from the drop down, but as a guest you can't see that, so it looks like they're just not doing anything. So it feels like there's lots of context that you miss by not having a screen share. So I tend to have so I've got two monitors, so I'd have like the screen share view on one window and then the more collaborative session on the other window. But yeah, it's all part of the fun of our new world of remote developing.
I actually think that Code With Me is quite nice there, because you also get integrated calling and screen sharing in there.
Oh, wow.
So inside of the IDE, you can actually set up a call, have multiple people there. There's a chat if you want to type something or send a link or whatever. And you can even do some screen sharing, I think since the latest version that was released.
Oh, I did not know that. So is that just another pane in the IDE itself?
It's another tool window. You can undock this tool window, make it full screen if you want. You can share screen, you can turn on video. We have voice call, everything is there.
Oh, nice. Now I'm even more excited about Code With Me. No pressure. But so before we wrap up, is there anything else you would like to mention?
Well, first of all, the Code With Me is also based on the same protocol I mentioned in the very beginning, RG. And the difference is huge, of course, because right now we bind not just to processes on the local machine, we bind to computers anywhere in the world. So this protocol is ready for these conditions as well. And the next thing we are focused is remote development. It's not about collaborative story. It is about you and your own dedicated development server. So imagine you have your own some Linux or Windows, whatever, some personal server, which is very powerful. You set up all the workspace, all the source code, all your solutions there. And the only thing you do is basically you connect to this server and work remotely. Like, treat it as Code With Me for yourself. You as a guest always connect to yourself as a host on this powerful server. This gives three super advantages to the industry. First is no source code on laptops, because for lots of companies, this is a major security issue right now. Secondly, this is the performance, because the laptop is not capable of running so much horsepower CPUs than the powerful desktop, powerful server. And the third one is sharing. And this is the most tricky one, but nevertheless, I think this is the most important one. Because once you have your own server, you can easily share your working space, your snapshot of what you are doing right now with someone else, because they can just connect to your server, of course, with the specific permissions and etc. So, for example, when we're sitting in the same office, in the same room, and we are working on laptops, and I want to share something, I literally walk to your desk, bring my laptop to you, take half an hour. Good, but the thing is that you don't know my shortcuts, you don't get used to my look and feels, to my themes. And you can also work with this feature branch or with this project, not just for half an hour, for 2 months, for example, and want to do it together. So you would probably say that, come on, there's Git. You can just share the repository. Yes, but no. No, because if you have a big project, it will take maybe 2 hours or maybe 2 days to set up the initial environment to work with. It's not just about checking out, reindexing, installing all the packages, configuring the SDKs, GDKs. Something will not work, of course, so you will waste tons of time for nothing. Instead, why can't it just connect to everything already prepared? Or you can duplicate the remote snapshot and share it, and you can work together. Or, which is even more interesting, you can orchestrate such backends within your company. So, for example, everyone in the company can immediately get access to the freshest master for any kind of repository you have in your organization. And not only this master branch will be up to date, everything will be indexed there, prepared, built. You don't have to build anything. All the built artifacts will be generated preemptively. And everything you have to do is just connect. 2-3 seconds, boom, you're ready. Everything is ready to go, regardless of the repository, regardless of the project. I think this is the future. We are not quite ready for it yet. And I think for 5, 7, 10 years, people will still do a lot of local development, which is fine. But we have to be prepared for the future. We believe that the future is remote development, and we're working on that.
So can the actual server, the thing that's running, can this run in lots of different... So obviously you mentioned it being remote. Can it be in like Docker containers, WSL, distros?
Yeah.
So it can be in all of these kind of things?
All of these kind of things, of course. Yeah. Dockers. Well, basically the first orchestration prototypes are basically Kubernetes with lots of Dockers, because if you have microservices, you have different solutions. And these solutions, we prefer to have them homogeneous, like all of them are .NET, C# 5, something like this. But in some companies, some of them are, for example, like Python microservices, Go microservices among the C# ones. So we have different project systems. So the overall project consists of different solutions. Each of those is represented with its own Docker, which mounts the corresponding repository and actually launches the corresponding IDE, Rider for C#, WebStorm for Node.js, PyCharm for Python. Yeah.
This sounds very similar. Like your description really reminds me of, I think it was episode 4, I think I had like Stuart Leeks on talking about WSL, but he was talking a lot about like dev containers and
Yes.
like basically the remote WSL stuff that you're describing. And it sounds a very similar kind of concept where anyone on the team can just share the same environment, the same configuration, and it just works. Because I've worked in companies before where I remember one specifically quite a few years ago where I started in a new team, and to get the code base up and working and compiling locally, it took about 2 days. And this isn't just me trying to learn it. This was with the lead developers sat with me thinking, oh, why aren't these scripts working anymore that we kind of... The last person that tried it was probably like 2 years ago. But
exactly, yes.
So it definitely sounds like such a good problem to overcome. And as you say, lots of people are on laptops now, and like we're not... Like, I'm quite lucky in the sense I've got quite a high-powered desktop here, but lots of people are on just like thin laptops on the computer. So if you can leverage the power that we've got in the cloud for building big architectures, I think that's definitely a win.
Yeah. You can treat it as inventing the save button inside the games, Previously, we didn't have any kind of save button. We have only levels, and if you're up on the end of the third level, you will go from scratch from the beginning of the third level. It kind of sucks. And here you can save, and this snapshot will be saved somewhere there in the cloud, either in the cloud or in WSL or, I don't know, in your private SSH server. It will be there, and everyone, you, yourself, or anyone will be able to connect to it. This is beautiful.
Yeah, I think so too. Working on the writer code base, for example, means we have to do a clone of IntelliJ. We have to do a clone of all of the .NET tools. And before you know it, there's 10 gigabytes that have gone over the wire. If you haven't synced in the past couple of days, you're probably 2,000 commits behind. It just takes a lot of time to get set up on your local machine. Even if you have all of the prerequisites installed to actually run it, it's still getting the code compiling, making sure that everything runs again and you can get working again. But if you would have some place that always has the latest main branch or the latest feature branch that you're working on with all those commits and just ready to go, that's amazing.
So is this something that's available now, or is this upcoming? Can the listeners go away and play with it?
You can play with it, I think, in a month and a half. It will be part of the EAP of 21.3 IntelliJ EAP and the rest of the tools. So right now, the basic SSH connection will be supported. So if you have SSH connection to whatever you have, either Docker or WSL, it doesn't matter. It should work. So we support two major workflows. We call it server to client and client to server. So server to client is that firstly you go to your Linux and with the command line you launch the headless IntelliJ server, dev server, against that specific source code preemptively. You launch it, it runs there, it waits you to connect to it. And so you launch it with the command line, you get the link the same way you get in the code with me, and then with this link you can connect from any kind of a client machine you want. You enter the SSH creds and you're there. And in comparison with code with me, you will have 99% of IntelliJ functionality. So thin client of a code with me is good, editor, code completion, some of the tool windows, but some like gigantic dialects, for example, project structure or editing cron configurations are still missing. Just takes too much time to view model all of them. So for remote development, this is not about doing something for an hour and go away. Remote development implies that you will use it every day. So most of the functionality should be there, 99%, and this will be there. So yeah, back to the flows. And the second flow is front end to back end flow, client to server flow. When you have your own machine, laptop, you have an SSH connection to your server, and with the user interface, you download the necessary IntelliJ to your server, or maybe not IntelliJ, maybe Rider or PyCharm, whatever. With the appropriate version, you will install it, launch it, and connect to it. And everything will be done from the UI of your laptop. So both of these approaches will find the users. For individuals, we suppose that client to server is the way to go. For organizations which want to preemptively warm up backends and development servers, server to client is the way to go.
That sounds really exciting. And I think, as I say, with the whole dev container stuff we spoke with Stuart Leaks, I've not played with that at all. And this sounds very similar. So it just feels like it's just yet another paradigm shift, which is going to make remote development, whichever solution you choose, that much smoother. Yeah, I'm definitely going to have to play with that when that's available. So I'm just looking at the time. So shall we do dev tips?
So yeah, I can share one dev tip regarding the IDE usage. Most people are not probably aware of this feature, but this saves so much time. Frankly speaking, this is called complete statement, and the shortcut is Control-Shift-Enter. And it basically completes the statement in lots of different ways. Let me explain. For example, you're writing a line, you call a method. I don't know, for example, you passed a string parameter inside of this method. So you wrote the string parameter there, and the only thing you have to do with this line of code is to place the closing bracket, semicolon, and then go to another line. So instead of doing all this, instead of moving your cursor, regardless of your cursor, you just press Control-Shift-Enter, and it will complete all of the rest automatically and move the cursor on the next line so you can continue coding. But the most exciting thing is that it was just one of the examples. It completes your statement and all of the other different ways when you're trying to do something, and the rest supposed to be, like the rest is obvious. The rest doesn't actually depend on you. Everything is done. You just want to finish it and write on the next line. If you get used to this shortcut, all of your coding routine will be like you're doing something, you invoke some shortcuts, and by then, Control-Shift-Enter. Boom, boom, Control-Shift-Enter. So in any case, you want to complete something, Control-Shift-Enter. And when you get used to it, it saves so much time. I really recommend it to you.
I actually thought that I pretty much used all the resharper shortcuts. Like use Alt Insert, Alt Enter, Shift, Control Shift R for refactor this, and then so moving things up and down into interfaces and things. But I don't use that one. So I'm actually going to take that on board and start trying to add that to my muscle memory and start using that one. That's a really good one.
Yeah, awesome. Try it.
All right. Yeah, I think my tip probably tacks on to what Kirill was mentioning. I would say invest some time in getting to know any tools that you are using, whether that's in IT, whether that's in life. I think it's a generally good tip. For example, here in Belgium, when the sun shines, it doesn't happen a lot. But when it happens, a lot of people start barbecuing. I actually like doing that as well. But I spent some time learning about how the airflow works and how to get started with slow cooking. It's just so awesome. It's amazing. And otherwise, I would still be just grilling, which is fine too. But I learned a new skill by getting to know those tools. So even if it's Visual Studio, if it's Rider or anything else that you have on your machine, get to know those tools. See if you have, for example, a JetBrains All Products pack. Get to know what's in there, maybe try a profiler or something and try to diagnose a memory leak in your applications. And if anything, you will just get better and build a better application. But maybe as a bonus, you will actually learn a new skill and enjoy the fact that you may be profiling your applications or using this specific new workflow that is in one of the tools that you are using. So invest some time in getting to know your tools.
Yeah, I will definitely agree with that. And I really like the way you took it out of context of programming as well. So it's anything you do, just understand it. And because there's probably lots of value in just understanding whatever it is a bit deeper. So my dev tip is basically using browser bookmarks more because this is more of like an observation really where I personally tend to find that I go to the same dev resource URLs a lot. For example, the same Azure resources, the same DevOps pipelines, the same current sprint in Jira or Azure boards or whatever it is. The same, like I use App Insights for logs. So I've got an issue. I want to jump to App Insights with the saved query selected. So I've got browser bookmarks for all of these things. And it quite often surprises me when pairing with others that most people don't do this. Like, for example, I'm finding that quite often people would go to the Azure portal, for example, each time and manually go to the portal itself, then click on resource groups and then find a resource from a list and then look around and try and find it every time. And like the same with build pipelines, all this kind of thing. So my dev tip is why waste time clicking around and finding the same things each and every time? Instead, just have an organized bookmark structure and use that instead of finding the same thing. So you can access whatever you want at the click of a button. I think it just saves so much time.
So you don't keep 500 tabs open at all time.
I'll still do that as well, but it's kind of it's one of those ones which kind of I keep on telling myself I'm going to be a bit cleaner with how many tabs I've got open. But it's as you're working on something and you go to one of these bookmarks or whatever, or then you open a Google page and search for a problem and stuff, and then leave it open, and then you get to the end of the day and the width of each tab is like a pixel. Yeah, I don't think I need to get better at that, but yeah. So before we wrap up, is there anything else you would like to mention?
Nothing from my side, at least.
No, it was a pleasure. It was a great interview. Love it.
Yeah, enjoyed the experience.
Oh, it's been really amazing having you on. Like I said at the start, I'm a big fan of Rider, so I've kind of been really looking forward to doing this episode. Yeah, no, I've really, really enjoyed it. And thank you everyone for listening. A quick reminder that this podcast is sponsored by Everstack, which is my own company, providing software development and consultation services. For more information, visit everstack.com. And if you're enjoying the podcast, please do help me spread the word on social media. I normally use the hashtag unhandledexception, and I can be found on Twitter at Dracan, Dracan, and my DMs are open. And my blog, danclark.com, has links to all my social stuff too. And we will include links to all the things we've mentioned today in the show notes, which can be found on unhandledexceptionpodcast.com.